Before we begin, I want to thank my comps committee for so graciously adapting to this virtual format for my Clase Magistral. For them and for anyone else who may be listening, I want to offer a few announcements before we get into it. First, I want to acknowledge that due to the extraordinary circumstances presented by the ongoing pandemic, the talk I'm about to give is no longer representative of my dissertation project, as I have now changed topics in order to achieve my goal of timely completion without archival research travel. I'm happy to address this change in the Q&A before my oral exam so that my committee is able to consider my research plans more accurately in their deliberations. Second, if you prefer to access this talk in text format, you can find a transcription in the video description along with a bibliography. Finally, before we begin, I do want to provide a content warning. This talk will involve descriptions of physical and sexual violence. All right, with all of that said, I will now begin my clase. Thank you for listening. There once was a widower named Liu Matias, a Catholic who had lived for 67 years in Muyang, a small river town in the southeastern Chinese region of Fujian. Matias was so fond of the priests that ministered to the village that he had joined their community, the Dominicans, as a lay member, marking himself out publicly as a Christian by wearing their distinctive habit. He had worked hard to instill his own fear of God and love of the catechism in his children, and had been overjoyed when 3 of his daughters chose to consecrate themselves to God as Dominican beatas, which was as close as you could get to being a nun without actually having to remain enclosed in a monastery. But the year was 1747, and Christians had fallen out of favor with the Qianlong emperor, and his friends and neighbors all over Fujian were being arrested and tortured every day. It was only a matter of time before it was his turn, and eventually it was. The interrogation was straightforward enough. The mandarin, or imperial official, asked him 2 simple questions. Are you a Christian? Do you have beatas for daughters? He answered, yes. The mandarin replied, well, from now on, you must no longer be a Christian, and you must marry off those daughters. But then, the missionary's account tells us, Matias refused. I cannot cease to follow God's law, nor can I marry my daughters, who have decided to serve God by observing virginity. But if you do not do what I tell you, the mandarin responded, I will whip you to death. God's will be done, said Matias, for I do not wish to offend him. And so Matias was whipped 10 times, and 10 times more, and thrown in prison. But at least he could survive, knowing that his daughters were saved from forced marriages. This story comes from the 1750 Vita, or Saint's Life, of the Catalan bishop Pere Sanz y Jordà, a Dominican missionary killed in China. The life was allegedly written from prison by his brother missionary and fellow martyr, Francisco Serrano. Their story was printed first at Manila, then in Sevilla and Valencia, accompanied by a compilation of stories like that of Matias that told of the heroism of Spanish and Chinese Christians alike as they faced persecution across southeastern China. Taken together, The Relación de la Persecución is a pretty straightforward propaganda piece written for the express purpose of promoting the cause of canonization for the Dominican martyrs of China. Publishing De Relación was a significant investment of resources for the order, and it paid off, circulating in several editions throughout Spain, as well as in translation in Italy and Germany. But a closer examination of a story like Matias's, the story of a father protecting his daughters from unwanted sexual attention from an overbearing agent of the state, reveals a plot all too familiar to scholars of the early modern honor play to be relegated entirely to the genre of hagiography. Time and again, the text figures male heroism as defense of female virtue. But perhaps more importantly, it figures male cruelty as attack on female virtue. In this talk, I will examine several such episodes in which Dominican missionaries leverage representations of laywomen in order to characterize Chinese imperial officials as tyrannical. In doing so, I aim to demonstrate that this construction of Chinese tyranny played a crucial role in justifying a divisively stringent Dominican missionary agenda throughout the 1750s and 1760s, thus shedding light on how violence against women shaped the shifting Christian subcultures of the Spanish Pacific. Now, before we proceed, there are a few terms I'd like to define to ensure we are all on the same page. When I talk about the Dominicans, I am referring to members of the Order of Preachers, a Catholic religious order that, as its name suggests, focuses on the spreading of the gospel through preaching and teaching. For our purposes, it is worth noting that they had been prominently established in Manila since 1587, from which they dispatched various missionary efforts to Fujian in southeastern China. The mission that we will be discussing today involved 5 priests, Pérez Sanz and Francisco Serrano, as well as Joaquín Royo, Juan Alcover, and Francisco Diaz, all of whom ministered for decades before being executed in 1747 and 1748. Beatas is an umbrella term for devout laywomen. In this context, it specifically refers to single women who elected not to marry, including widows who elected not to remarry, in favor of forming religious communities. In China, we will specifically be talking about Beatas who were members of the Third Order of St. Dominic, which was known in this time as a factory for female mystic saints, most famously St. Catherine of Siena and St. Rosa of Lima. Female members of the Third Order were essentially nuns in everything except the observation of enclosure. And finally, if we are going to be talking about how representations of Beatas were crafted to show Chinese imperial officials were tyrannical, it is important to define what tyranny meant within the discursive community of Dominican missionary friars. In his discussion of tyranny, St. Thomas Aquinas echoes the definition found in Aristotle's Politics. Tyranny is monarchy for the ruler's benefit, rather than for the common good. Aquinas develops this definition further in his treatise on kingship, extending this idea of domination over a population to spiritual domination as well. There, he writes, "Nor does the tyrant merely oppress his subjects in corporal things, but he also hinders their spiritual good. Those who seek more to use than to be of use to their subjects prevent all progress, suspecting all excellence in their subjects to be prejudicial to their own evil domination. For tyrants hold the good in greater suspicion than the wicked, and to them the valor of others is always fraught with danger. Tyrants strive to prevent those of their subjects who have become virtuous from acquiring valor and high spirit, in order that they may not want to cast off their iniquitous domination." Essentially, in this context, the narrative goal is to show that the Chinese government is not simply a foreign civilization exercising routine sovereignty over its people, but rather that it is specifically tyrannical because it is hostile to the cultivation of virtue. As we will see, each episode of violence against women contributes to this characterization by demonstrating how the cultivation of female virtue is considered inherently suspicious by imperial officials, leading to increasingly shocking abuses of power. The first episode I would like to discuss involves the interrogation and torture of Quo Teresa Chun, who is identified as the prioress or leader of the community of Beatas at Muyang. Eugenio Menegon, working from contemporaneous Chinese sources, identifies the prioress under a slightly different name, Teresa Guo Guanchi. Either way, Teresa would have been the religious superior of the 3 daughters of Leo Matias that I mentioned at the start of this talk. As I will argue, Teresa's courageous defense of her community's innocence is constructed as a foil for the unfounded, vulgar accusations of Chinese bureaucrats, positioning them as lechers, jealous of the women's commitment to Christ. The prioress is first mentioned in the context of the Mandarin's search for Pérez Sanz, the leader of the Dominican mission to Fujian. Despite being tortured to give up his location, Teresa insisted that she had no idea where he might be found, as did her niece, Quo Lucia knew. Teresa and Lucia were then detained, along with 3 male Chinese Christians and one of the Spanish friars, Juan Alcover. His fellow friar, Serrano, writes of their detention. "It is not possible to relay the particulars of our great suffering in those days, both us friars and these poor Christians. Some fled to the mountains with their families. Others hid in houses belonging to the Gentiles. The soldiers went about sacking their houses, especially in Muyang and Quitong. Fishing in troubled waters, the thieves took their reward. They forget that night will come. By day, they robbed houses, feigning that they did so as soldiers. Add to that the lewdness of the soldiers, so dishonorable toward the poor women. What torments did they spare the poor women and girls as they went from house to house? And even the cruel captain at their hearing. Some of the women had fingers black as ash, for they had already been beaten 3 or 4 times. Before continuing with the narration of Teresa's interrogation in particular, I would like to pause to observe a few notable aspects of this passage. First, it is essential that Serrano refers to non-Christians as Gentiles, both here and throughout the text. While there are many vocabularies of difference available to Serrano, he chooses a biblical one, defined specifically by the potential to convert. Moreover, he portrays the Gentiles as friendly to the fleeing Christians, offering them shelter. This is crucial to observe lest we assume Serrano intends to characterize the Chinese generally as tyrannical. He in fact limits his critique specifically to agents of Chinese empire. Second, in describing the soldiers' plunder of the Christians' houses, he deploys the Spanish expression, a río revuelto, ganancia de pescadores. While this is a common idiom, generally referring to taking advantage of a bad situation, expressed in English by the idea of good fishing in troubled waters, here, it lends itself to multiple meanings. For one, Muyang is literally on the river, making the image of fishing for wealth in the homes of likely fishermen particularly cruel. But in addition to that, the image of the soldier as predatory fisherman inverts the evangelical image of the missionary as a fisher of men. Here, instead of seeking the eternal wealth of salvation, the soldiers fish for the temporal wealth of ill-gotten gains. Serrano here reinscribes the trope of the avaricious conquistador in a Chinese context, implying that this campaign of persecution is mere pretext for plunder, the classic behavior of tyrannical power that, as Aquinas wrote, intends only to make use of the people. Third, the attitude of the soldiers toward Christian women and girls is described specifically as lewd and dishonorable. While the nature of the tormento to which they were subjected by the soldiers is left unspoken, these adjectives imply sexual intimidation or violence. As we will see when we continue with Teresa's interrogation, the allegation of sexual violence against beatas was precisely what the imperial officials levied at Spanish missionaries. Here, Serrano lays the foundation for the reader to connect that allegation with a projection on the part of the officials, who were committing such crimes themselves. In addition, in an echo of many a Golden Age comedy, he paints the soldiers and their captain alike as incapable of self-control, even and especially when the stakes are as high as a woman's honor. Finally, the description of the tormento of beaten fingers is a trope in xenophobic European narrative. The use of a bastinado, or a thick bamboo stick, in beatings loomed large as a practice akin to human sacrifice among the Aztecs, to use Ricardo Padrón's comparison. Chinese corporal punishment, like Aztec human sacrifice, was leveraged to expose a seemingly impressive civilization as inherently barbaric. All of these details, from the distinction between mere pagan and soldier, to persecution as pretext for the plunder of women and goods, to the trope of corporal punishment as barbarism. All of these details contribute to a portrayal of Chinese imperial officials as tyrants, actively abusing their power. As we will see, Serrano doubles down on this portrayal when narrating the interrogation of the prioress, whose arrest we have just noted. The first words Teresa uttered during her interrogation, we are told, were these: "Gracias a Dios." Thanks be to God. The Mandarin gave his own three-word response: "Apretar las cuerdas," tighten the restraints. While the male Christians before her had been asked about their beliefs, Teresa's actions were of interest. Serrano writes, "They asked Beata Teresa if she was a beata, if she cooked food for the European, that is, Perezans, and if she had evil relations with him. While her answers are not recorded, this would not be the last opportunity she had to respond. Nevertheless, it is already clear that the account portrays the Mandarin's view of the beata as a collaborator, figured as a concubine. After all, if a woman was willing to cook for a man who was not her husband, there was no limit to what else she might be willing to provide to him. But the Mandarin's allegations quickly became more specific and more disturbing. The interrogation of the Spanish friars focused on the crozier, or shepherd's crook, that had been confiscated from them. While the friars explained that its only use was as a symbol of pastoral care that bishops, like Perezans, held during Mass, the Mandarins insisted that they confess its true use, that it was used to penetrate the women and blow air into them. This fixation with the crozier appears in several interrogations, but most explicitly in Teresa's. She denies the allegation vociferously, saying, "Es un engaño manifiesto." This is clearly a trick. She argues that the Mandarin must simply have misunderstood her explanation of the part of the rite of baptism, when the minister breathes 3 times on the candidate in the form of the cross to symbolize new life in Christ. This portrayal of Teresa as a theologically literate leader who perceives the deception of her torturers poses a stark contrast to the mandarins, who have conjured up a bizarre, perverse use for the symbol of ecclesial authority. The mandarin, unimpressed, sends her off for another beating. Serrano's description of her beaten hands is harrowing. As this angelic beata had already suffered the torment twice in Fujian, her hands were greatly injured and her fingers very broken, which caused her to later lose feeling in them because of the intensity of the pain. His Excellency, that is, Peresans, begged Saint Rosa for her intercession. In fact, we are told that the interrogation took place on the feast day of Santa Rosa de Lima, a meaningful omen within a narrative that sought to place Chinese beatas as the inheritors of a successful record of female Dominican sanctity in the Americas. Unsatisfied with Teresa's continued refusal, the mandarin intensified his tactics, turning his bastinado on her nephew, Ambrosio. Though he promised to free him if Teresa confessed to having been penetrated with the crozier, she refused, telling Ambrosio, "Ask God to free you. I do not wish to free you with blasphemy and pernicious lies." Eventually, recognizing Teresa would remain unmoved, the mandarin gave up for the day. But now, the reader has seen the mandarin not only unjustly torture the falsely accused, but torture an innocent child, completely unconnected with the alleged crime. Next time, the mandarin brought out not only Teresa for interrogation, but also her niece, Lucia, with whom she had been arrested, as well as 3 other beatas, Guo Luisa Cha, Miut Wana Chin, and Chin Rosa Hui. Expecting dissension in the ranks, the community instead responds in unison. Serrano tells us, the mandarins asked them, "Have you slept with the Europeans?" They responded, "From our youth we have consecrated our virginity to Jesus Christ. We understand nothing of such filth. Have your Europeans blown into your wombs with these tubes that they have?" They responded, "Those tubes are the crozier, which the bishop uses for solemn feast days. It is not used to blow into women." At this point, the mandarin brought Teresa over for her final beating, using not the bastinado this time, but the crozier. Now, this portrait of Chinese imperial tyranny is complete. His barbarism is so uncontrollable that not only does he engage in such infamous corporal punishment in the first place, and not only does he apply it to complete innocence, but he even transforms this symbol of priestly authority into a weapon to wield against saintly women. If the imagined use of the crozier to violate a woman's body and her honor with it was difficult to stomach, the reader is now faced with the actual use of the crozier, not to shepherd a soul in agony, but to torture her. In the end, Serrano tells us, Teresa and the other beatas were sentenced to beatings and to the canga, that is, portable stocks. But of course, they could be restored to society if they were willing to pay a small fine. The tyrant's exploitation of the people for his own personal gain continues. Having concluded Teresa's story, how does this measure up to our definitions of tyranny? The multiple allusions to the persecution of Christians as a pretext for plundering Christian money and women clearly meet Aristotle's standard of power seeking its own enrichment. As for the obsession with the beata as collaborator and concubine, and the cartoonish inability of the mandarins to process Teresa's explanation of the crozier as perfectly innocent, we find an echo of Aquinas' portrait of tyrannical jealousy, suspecting all excellence in their subjects to be prejudicial to their own evil domination. The second episode that I would like to discuss is not found in the body of Serrano's text, but rather in the appendix compiled by the provincial superior, Francisco Payas. The story of Petronila Wang takes place in Dingto, 10 leagues down the river from where we began in Muyang. Payas tells us that the number of beatas there was growing so much that the devil simply could not stand the fragrance of such blooming virtue, and so he hatched a plot to cut down one of its most beautiful flowers, the maiden Petronila. She had overcome many difficulties to become baptized, only to then face great persecution for her celibacy, having to defend herself against attacks on her virginity. Payas then pivots to giving Petronila's backstory. We learn that Petronila had a particular gift for healing children from the deadly disease of mal del viento, or wind disease. Eugenio Menegon identifies this condition with the Chinese term fengbing, used generically for seizures and paralyses. In this context, he argues, Petronila would most likely have worked as an acupuncturist. He further notes that the Beatas were known for their medical skills and charitable endeavors. Above all, a leper hospice for women in nearby Fuan County. Petronila's story then continues, noting how her reputation for healing grew among the Gentile population. They would bring her their children, and often Petronila could tell they would not survive no matter what remedies she applied. In such cases, she asked their parents if they would be willing to let her baptize them, so that their souls might see God. Payas says that most parents gave her their permission, for they knew that if Petronila could not cure the child, there was no cure to be had. But when they did not, she did so in secret regardless. While Petronila did most of the baptisms herself, she did occasionally have time to smuggle in one of the Spanish missionaries, Juan Alcover, for the sacrament. Now, while it was and is perfectly licit for a layperson to baptize, it is worth pausing to remark on how shocking it is to find this tale of a woman carrying out her own medical practice as a cover for her own evangelical ministry. Her role as physician of both bodies and souls makes her a clear Christ figure, on par with the priests lauded in the rest of the text. Even more interestingly, the secrecy of her position inverts the common medieval and Renaissance trope of the abortionist, whose work is a cover for both society's general indiscretions and a side business of prostitution. If Celestina figures are portrayed as wreaking secret violence on bodies and souls alike, Petronila's parallel role as a secret healer is a stunning reinscription by a missionary author of a figure who might just as likely be found in an Inquisition trial as in this hagiography. Realizing that Petronila's baptismal practice was a conduit of such continuous spiritual fruit, Payas tells us, the devil realized he had to put an end to it. Petronila was arrested, along with 3 fellow beatas, Úrsula, Lucia, and Isabel, para que cegadas tales flores se impidiesen los frutos que prometían, so that, these flowers cut short, they would be prevented from growing the further fruits they promised. Payas includes a statement on Petronila and her companions from a man he calls the Virrey Tártaro de Fokien, or the Tartar Viceroy of Fujian, who was the superior of the local mandarin who would carry out their punishment. While the women's fate is not stated, their resistance to marriage is given as the reason for issuing a new policy that all Christian religious items are to be burned, and religious instruction is to be prohibited. The viceroy writes, Petronila and all the other imprudent and ignorant country women are perverted and much deceived, following the false law so carefully, refusing to be married, even into their old age. You should take all the books, images, and anything belonging to that religion and turn them over to the treasury so that they might be burned. It is most unwise to permit them to instruct one another in this falsehood. In this statement, we can hear echoes of Serrano's efforts to characterize the persecution as a pretext for plunder. After all, if the viceroy truly intends to have gilded Christian liturgical art and valuable books burned, why not have the mandarins do the deed themselves, rather than have them turn the items over to the treasury? By placing such evidently avaricious language in the mouth of an urban bureaucrat, who insults rural women as ignorant in the same breath, Payas plays directly into the trope of Beatus Ille, which idealizes the countryside as a landscape of virtue in order to shame the city, and specifically the court, as a site of vice. Moreover, his use of European political terms such as viceroy to identify the mandarin's regional superior play into a long-standing Spanish literary tradition of assigning moral degradation to the pilfering administrative class, rather than to the king or the emperor directly. Crucially, in place of the vulgar accusations we saw with Teresa, here, the Beata's observation of virginity is totally taken for granted, and their unmarried status is precisely the problem. In this period, the viceroy's preference for marriage over virginity would have had clear connotations of diabolical error for its missionary authors and its religious audience. The 16th century Council of Trent had proclaimed the superiority of virginity over marriage as dogma binding for the whole church. In the context of the Counter-Reformation, this tenet became a key difference in doctrine, affirming Catholic supremacy over Protestants in Europe and over pagans in the colonies. In light of such a theological and political paradigm, Alison Weber has argued that beatas had major symbolic value. as vowed virgins who nevertheless ministered in the world rather than remaining enclosed behind monastery walls. The Beata was living proof that religious life was not a special vocation, hidden away for the few, and much less some punishment for the daughter with a smaller dowry. Rather, the Beata showed that religious life was a superior way of being, accessible to anyone who had the spiritual discipline to commit to it. And as such, their reputation for holiness reflected well on the pastors who guided them in this role. With this paradigm in mind, the Viceroy's disparaging remarks about the value of virginity constitute the kind of hostility toward virtue that characterizes every tyrant. Let us revisit that definition of tyranny once again. It is clear from the continued allusions to monetary exploitation that Aristotelian tyrannical self-interest is at play once again. But I want to turn our attention to the latter half of Aquinas' description. Tyrants hold the good in greater suspicion than the wicked, and to them the valor of others is always fraught with danger. Tyrants strive to prevent those of their subjects who have become virtuous from acquiring valor and high spirit in order that they may not want to cast off their iniquitous domination. It might seem that this story fits this definition rather obviously. The officials spare not even Petronila, who healed many of their subjects' children, regardless of religious belief, because goodness is inherently suspicious to the tyrant. But here, it is fascinating that Petronila's status as a healer who secretly baptizes the dying children of non-Christians is not even in play. Rather, the account tells us she is persecuted for her virginity alone. This reduction of a fascinating and colorful life to a woman's marital status or lack thereof certainly strikes me as frustrating. However, it is also very telling. Neither the missionary author nor the reported speech of the Viceroy perceives Petronila's pastoral ministry or independent medical practice as threatening. Rather, it is her unwillingness to submit to marriage that is considered such a problem that it justifies a campaign of iconoclasm and destruction. Of course, it is her refusal to marry that makes it possible for her to have a pastoral ministry and independent medical practice in the first place. But the Viceroy and the missionary both decide to debate her merits on the basis of sexual independence alone. For the missionary author, this renders his mission an interesting one. His flock is not so much being punished for spreading the gospel per se, so much as for spreading the dogma of female celibacy. Nowhere in the text are male Chinese celibates, whether priests or laymen, persecuted for their refusal to marry. They may be persecuted for other forbidden religious activities, but celibacy is only ever portrayed as a threat when it is practiced by beatas. In this context, the official's unwillingness to even countenance peaceful evangelization has a double meaning. It is most unwise to permit them to instruct one another in this falsehood. It is not only Christianity in general that he characterizes as falsehood, but it's female celibacy specifically. And so it is not Petronila's valor as a tireless healer that is fraught with danger. It is her celibate belonging to Christ that causes suspicion. In cracking down on all Christian practice in response to this growing female phenomenon, the Chinese imperial officials have shown themselves striving to prevent their virtuous subjects from acquiring valor and high spirit in order that they may not want to cast off their iniquitous domination, not just as governors, but as husbands. I now want to turn our attention to one final and very brief episode of violence against women, the one from which this talk draws its title. Also found in Bias's appendix, this story takes place in the prison of Huquan, where Christian women and children were being detained as they awaited exile to Tartary, a generic term for Central Asia, in punishment for their faith. One of the Spanish missionaries, Joaquin Royo, attempted to bring them the sacraments, but he failed to gain entrance to the prison. Instead, a Chinese priest, Pablo Su, got past the guards by pretending to be a doctor. Once he was inside the women's section of the prison, he administered confession and the Eucharist to them all. Bias tells us they were consoled and overjoyed, but ultimately, they had practical matters to attend to. He writes, considering the nearness of winter and the intensity of the cold where they were to be exiled, they presented a petition to the Viceroy of Fujian, asking him to grant them the favor of remaining in Fuzhou until winter had passed. For two of the women, Tekla and Paula, were ill, and so neither they nor the children would be able to survive the harsh cold of Tartary. But the heart of the Viceroy was in such thrall to cruelty and tyranny that, with no pity for the delicate sex of the sick women, nor compassion for the tender age of the children, His arrogance denied them even such limited benevolence. The portrait of the viceroy as tyrant has now reached its most obvious iteration. Here, he not only lacks pity for women, but for their children. And the sin that impedes his compassion is named altivez, arrogance or pride. The failure of the viceroy to hear the prisoner's petition is painted as a devastating flaw of character, a problem with the heart. Now, rather than turning to the same Aquinas quotes about tyranny that we have been referencing so far, I want to put Paula and Tecla's story in dialogue with another passage from later in his treatise on kingship. In the 11th chapter, Aquinas meditates on the relationship between the tyrant and his subjects. When they seek their own good instead of the common good, there is little or no communion between them and their subjects. Consequently, there can be little or no friendship between tyrants and their subjects. Here, it is not his denial of the women's petition that makes the viceroy a tyrant, but rather his nature as a tyrant has hardened his heart such that he is incapable of empathizing with their need. Aquinas goes on to conclude that, common interests and fellowship being unavailable to the tyrant, the government of a tyrant is maintained by fear alone, and consequently they strive with all their might to be feared by their subjects. So rather than granting them the status of martyrs among their own community, the viceroy elects a punishment that strikes true fear: isolation from the church in exile, a slow and painful death by nature. One question now remains: why does it matter that Chinese imperial power appears as tyrannical in this text? Well, as I laid out in my introduction, I argue that this construction of Chinese tyranny played a crucial role in justifying a divisively stringent Dominican missionary agenda throughout the 1750s and 1760s. At this point in the history of Catholic missions to Asia, the Dominicans were on the rise, at least in theory. Despite their failed missions to China and their subsequent need to spin devastating massacres like this one as the eternal triumph of martyrs, the order had won its primary ideological battle in the region, the Chinese rites controversy, which centered around the question of whether traditional Confucian practices had to be extinguished in order for the Chinese to become truly Christian. The Jesuits, who enjoyed far more practical success in the Asian missions, had argued that Confucianism was more of a culture and a philosophy than a religion, and as such, its customs could be incorporated into Christianity, much as Greek and Roman customs had been. The Dominicans argued that it was very much a religion, and so converts could not truly be considered converts until they ceased practicing their old customs. After duking it out in Rome, the Pope sided with the Dominicans, and Chinese rites were officially banned in 1704. The issue had been somewhat reignited, however, with Pope Benedict XIV's bull of 1742, which affirmed the ban in China and extended it to India. By the time Payas put together this Relación in 1750, the order was poised to take advantage of this renewed policy by intervening more substantially in the Fujian mission, which after the missionary's death was largely run by Chinese priests and laymen. In this context, it is no coincidence that two of the three stories that I have analyzed here, specifically those of Petronila and Paula and Tecla, are to be found in Payas's appendix. Based in Manila when this text was published in 1750, Payas was soon to be appointed the successor of Pérez Sanz as Vicar Apostolic of Fujian, overseeing the Dominican mission to China. His administration was characterized by what Eugenio Menegon has called grand schemes to expand the reach of his mission and relocate his men at will to reconstruct what the 1746 government campaign had destroyed. Most relevantly for our purposes, he was a hardliner when it came to canon law, becoming so well known for extirpating local Chinese practices that both his Spanish and his Chinese subordinates denounced him to the Vatican 5 times as unfit to lead such a delicate mission. It is telling, then, that Payas compiled not only the lives of the martyrs, but narratives of their legacy, one that included Chinese woman after Chinese woman who had no problem conforming to Spanish expectations, in this case, expectations for female celibate sanctity. In the context of the extirpation campaign he was about to launch in Fujian, these stories can be read as proof of concept, a carefully curated portrait of a fruitful evangelization strategy tragically cut short by state incursion that was in need of desperate revival. And sure enough, Payas got the job. The preferred institutional vision for the Fujian mission is portrayed rather pointedly in the text. Chinese beatas, under the pastoral care of Spanish Dominicans, are the powerhouse of sanctity that will propel the church to a prosperous future if only imperial tyranny can be curtailed. Neither Serrano nor Payas offers a specific proposal on how to curtail that tyranny, and the military option was certainly out of fashion at this stage. But perhaps they look to this very treatise by Aquinas for a solution. Aquinas addresses the question of how to be rid of a tyrant by saying, "Should no human aid whatsoever against a tyrant be forthcoming? Recourse must be had to God, the King of all, who is a helper in due time of tribulation. For it lies in his power to turn the cruel heart of the tyrant to mildness." And in the meantime, if God wasn't forthcoming, who knows? Perhaps the reader might consider joining the order to keep it in the fight. Thank you very much for joining me for this talk. I invite anyone watching this from the department to join us in Zoom for the Q&A at 9:45 a.m. on Monday, March 31st. The link can be found in the SIP Oral Exams and Dissertation Defenses Collab site. Once again, thank you.